with us. If you're thinking about tuning out because you feel like the session is not going to apply to you, I want to ask you to hold on. I want to ask you to hold on because I want to ask you to trust me. Even if you are not living in a blended family, the reality is there are blended families all around you. It's becoming more and more common that families are blended in many different ways. And I have the pleasure of sharing some of the facts with you, some tips with you, and just some general, information and stories of my own that I have to share with you today. I'd like to start by sharing a verse with you. It's one that you're familiar with. Kurt actually read it to you earlier today, but it is 1 Corinthians 13, 4-7. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no records of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Well, I think we already know that this verse is such a challenge even for a regular marriage, right? For us to make a commitment like this, it requires a lot of sacrifice, a lot of intention. But I will tell you, if you've ever been part of or know of a blended family, you know that it challenges every single one of these in a way that nothing else could. So I'd like to give you a definition of what exactly is a blended family. And I'll be honest with you, there was a long time where I really didn't understand what noted it. I really just thought it was people who married people who had kids and they joined together, but it's actually a little bit more broad than that. So I'll read this definition. It is a family unit comprised of both biological and adopted children and or with children of different races and or a family with step-parent relationships arising from remarriage with parents who already have children from a previous marriage or relationship. So for a long time, I wasn't really aware that adopted families actually fall under a blended family umbrella. And the reason that is because you're blending different genetics, you're blending different family styles together. So if you've adopted a child from a different genetic pool that has a different family style, you're blending them into your family. And so actually, technically, even adoptive families fall under this category, which is something that I myself, until I started doing this work, did not know. So earlier you heard a little bit about my credentials, and by now you're aware that I've worked with families for a number of years, and I've particularly worked in contentious divorce and co-parenting counseling, which means I have worked with a lot of blended families, and I've worked with family members of blended families. But first and foremost, before any of my practical and, I guess, educational experience and training, I'm part of a blended family myself. So this is a picture of my husband and I and our 4 kids on our vow renewal day. So it might be a little bit deceiving because my husband and I were married before we had our 2 biological children together, but we didn't actually have our wedding until about 8 years into our marriage. So it took us quite a while to get to that point, and there's a reason behind that. So when I met my husband, he was a widowed single father of a 1 and 2-year-old little boys. And I had been in a relationship where I had lost my spouse as well. And so my husband and I really connected on this level. And so we don't have ex-spouses that we deal with, but I did adopt his 2 biological children, Ian and Kyler, which are definitely my sons. And I will tell you that I grew up in a situation where I had a broken family. I talked a little bit about my dad in our other breakout session, but what I didn't talk about was the fact that my dad was remarried for a number of years to my stepmother. And it was kind of that quintessential stepmother, stepmonster kind of situation where it was not a good situation. And so when I married my husband, I was very, very much against the term stepmother. It had a traumatic connotation to it for me. And so when I said I do to my husband, I said I do to my sons. And from that point forward, from the moment we decided to get married, those were my kids. What I've realized years later is that in some ways that was a mistake because I was very protective that we were one unit, we were one family. We didn't talk about the fact that we were blended. In fact, at the time, way back when, I didn't even know that we were considered to be blended because neither one of us had been divorced. And I just adopted the kids as my kids. But I will say that that meant I missed out on a lot of support. But there's some important things about our story that I'll tell you, without God's intervention, without him being the cornerstone and the foundation of our marriage, I would not be standing here in front of you today. It was hard because I was competing with a ghost. She was always going to do things better than I was. She would have been a better wife than I was. Justin might have been ready to move on, but nobody in his family was. I was definitely not welcomed. And that leads us to this photograph. So when we got married, his wife hadn't been gone for very long when we met each other. And there was a lot of shame and a lot of, hiding about the fact that he had met someone new and was going to get married. And so we didn't have a wedding. There was a lot of hurt that was involved for me because, I was ready to be married and have all the things. But I realized very quickly that marrying into a blended situation meant that I was competing with the love that his family had with someone else, someone that they lost, that they preferred because I was a stranger, they didn't know me, and I did things differently. I wasn't just marrying my husband, I was marrying his family, and I was marrying her family. There were different ways of doing things. There were different ways of handling things. And it was very, very difficult, and it put a lot of pressure on our marriage. So I want you to think of it in terms of, a blender. So when you put in red and yellow, I think they make green. I'm not really sure. But if you blend them together, they're not going to be red and they're not going to be yellow. They're going to be a different color. But I think in our head, when we think about, I know who I am, I know what I want, I know what I think. So we assume that whatever color we are is the color our family is going to be. Well, there's a problem with that, because when you put two completely different colors, two completely different people together, you've got to deal with how they're different. And you've got to recognize that you're going to have to bend and shape and mold. But when you're in a blended family, you've got way more than just two colors. Sometimes you've got 4 different colors because maybe, both spouses have remarried other spouses and they have kids together or kids from other marriages. I mean, you're just blending so many different colors, and it gets to a point where you might not even be sure what color it is. Maybe it's just black. And that can be a real challenge. So how prevalent is this? Well, more than 40% of American adults have at least one step relative. So think about that. That's almost half. Half of our population has at least one step relative. So that means you might have a step, uncle, you might have a step grandparent, you might have a stepfather or mother, or a son-in-law, daughter-in-law. You can have step all over the place, right? And so that means that it's very impossible to think that none of us have escaped having some relationship with a step relative at some point in time in our lives. 16% of children are in blended families. So, sorry about that. So 16% of children are in blended families. This is not necessarily divorced families, so that statistic is actually much higher, but 16% of children live in a blended family where a parent has been remarried. So that's a pretty high percentage of kids who are living in blended families. So the struggle is real. Being in a blended family doesn't just affect the people that are actually in it. Everybody around it, the culture, the friends, the family, grandparents, everyone has to adapt when there's a change in a relationship. And so this can cause a lot of stress and a lot of strife. According to the Pew Research Center, 40% of new marriages include at least one person who was previously married. So 40% of new marriages include at least one person who is previously married. And 20% of weddings feature 2 people have both been married prior. So think about that. 20% of marriages that happen today have both people have already been previously married, which means the chances of them bringing children from previous marriages together is pretty high as well. And if we recall from the last session that I did regarding mental illness, we know that there's a pretty good chance that a lot of those marriages involve some form of mental illness. So we're mixing a lot of things together, and some of these things we're not prepared for. We meet somebody, we see them. We don't see their past. We don't see their previous marriage. We don't see their family. We see them, which is wonderful, but also short-sighted. I mentioned this in mental health too, that we need to consider, what are we blending? What is involved in this? It's more complicated than our feelings allow us to see it whenever we're first falling in love with someone and deciding that we want to start a relationship with them. So this is the least fun part of this conversation, but it's important for me to share with you that about 60 to 70% of marriages involving children from a previous marriage fail. That's why we're having this conversation. That's a pretty high failure rate. 60 to 70% isn't necessarily a statistic that I'm pleased with. That means a lot of blended families who've already been through hurt are likely to have more hurt. The average marriage, first marriage, ends in divorce about 30 to 35% of the time. So what we're looking at is that a blended family has about twice the failure rate of a traditional marriage of a first-time relationship. This includes people who maybe weren't previously married, but are marrying someone who has children from a previous marriage. So you don't necessarily have to have ever been married. If you've married someone who has been previously married, you are at risk of this same statistic. So that comes back to the concept of blending colors. We're blending ideas, we're blending parenting styles, we're blending traditions and routines. We're adding a lot more people into the mix. So if you're a grandparent and your child was married to someone and they had your grandchildren and then they get divorced and then your child gets married to somebody else, you're not going to stop having a relationship with that grandchild. So you are splitting yourself so many different degrees. But also as the newly married person or the blended person, you're also split in a lot of different directions because you have to consider holidays and family situations and custody for more than just your kids. You also now have to consider it for the children of your spouse. And sometimes that's complicated, especially if there's contention and there's problems. This wasn't a happy split. And you hear these stories about couples who are able to stay friends and co-parent well. And while that's wonderful and it does happen, it's not as common as I wish it was. So I want to talk a little bit about the do's and the don'ts. So I'm giving you these statistics, and it could be a little bit disheartening, and I can understand that, especially if you're in a blended family and you are struggling right now. Part of you is probably wondering, how is this helping me? It's already done. I'm already remarried. We're already struggling. And so my goal here is to give you some practical tips and some information on how maybe to alleviate some of that stress that you might be experiencing. So numero uno, this is a big no-no. Don't talk negatively about the other parent. So when I say the other parent, I'm speaking of whether it's you who were married and it's your ex-spouse or it's your new spouse's ex-spouse. Do not talk negatively about them, especially in front of the kids. It is where our heart is where our energy goes. And so if our energy is going into talking negatively about part of our past, it's not taking us anywhere good. And it's never, ever good for kids. It puts a lot of pressure on our relationship with our own children and the relationship we're trying to build with the children of our new spouse. Don't force relationships. This is a big one, and I think oftentimes our hearts might be in the right place. We really want to connect. We really want things to feel good. We want to develop that quintessential, beautiful blended family where everybody gets along and we can be the great next mom or second dad. But the reality is when we try to force that relationship, it can create a lot of trauma because our ready isn't their ready sometimes. Don't involve your significant other in the kids in the ex drama. I didn't read that well. Let me do that again. Don't involve your significant other or the kids in ex drama. So this is a hard one when you are co-parenting with an ex-spouse, you might be frustrated. They might say and do things that just drive you up the wall. You don't know how to handle it. And so the temptation is to go to your new spouse or to speak about it in front of the kids or even to the kids. This is a big no-no. We don't want to do this because this creates damage. This creates a lack of security in the relationship because, first of all, for your kids, that's not their ex, that's their parent. And they're always going to view them as being their parent. They're not going to latch on to the enemy perspective that you might be projecting on them because you're frustrated. If you're involving your new spouse in that drama, you're creating distance between you and the person that you're trying to cultivate a relationship with now. When you're trying to move forward and see where you're going, you can't do that very well if you're looking back. And oftentimes, even if our new spouse recognizes that we're just complaining or we're frustrated, the reality is it draws them into that drama. It creates resentment on their part because that energy I was talking about isn't put on them or your current relationship. It's still placed in the past, and that can be very confusing. Don't segregate. Don't segregate your kids. I see this a lot where it's your kids and my kids. So if your one child is into a sport and you go to all their games, but the step parent isn't involved in what that child is doing, that creates segregation. If you want to create a healthy, functioning, blended family, we have to stop acting blended in the traditional sense. We have to actually blend. What that means is that we're willing to sacrifice. Maybe you aren't into sports. Maybe that's not what you like. But your new spouse and his kid or kids are really involved in that. It's sacrifice. It is transforming yourself. It is being willing to say, okay, this isn't my thing. This isn't my family's thing. This isn't part of our tradition, but I have chosen this family to be part of me. And so I'm going to sacrifice so that I can participate. That is an incredible way to create connection and security where you no longer operate as these separate entities. And that's really what it is. You're operating separately and selfishly because you're used to doing it your way and they're used to doing it their way. And it's an ineffective blending when we say, well, you do that and I'll do this. Just as if it were your kids together, you would both probably go to games sometimes. So the same kind of attitude should be given when it's a stepchild. Don't take things personally. So I mentioned a minute ago that they're ready. You're ready isn't necessarily they're ready. What that means is that we have to give time. We might be ready to move on and get married to somebody new, but that doesn't mean that our kids are ready for that. It doesn't mean that our families are ready for that. Maybe the grandparents or the aunts and uncles or the siblings had a really good relationship with your ex. And it's going to take them a little bit more time to develop vulnerability and trust and maybe even feel like they can open up to a new person. That trauma that you experienced in your divorce didn't stop with you or your separation. Maybe you weren't even married. Maybe you were just together for a long time and you had kids together. But sometimes the people around you might act out. They might be resistant. The kids might have, some difficult behaviors. They might be resistant to connection. They might say mean things. Keep in mind, though, that this is not personal. This is their own emotional process they have to go through. And one of the best things we can do is just be with them. Be present with them. Allow them to have their feelings, but create good boundaries within that terrible feeling. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. Most important thing is don't go it alone. I talked about needing a village in my last segment. The same is true here. We were not wired to do things in isolation. We were wired for connection. And blended families, they need support. They need people in their lives who are going to champion them and accept the fact that they've made this decision to move on and create a new family with somebody else. You need a community to support you and help you through the difficulties of trying to blend a family. Even if you're not blended and you're raising kids and you're trying to do life, you can't do that alone either. We all need our community in order to thrive. So now we're going to talk about the do's. So some of you are probably already married. This is, this doesn't apply to you. But I will say to those of you who are dating, who are considering dating, or are already planning on getting married, do consider counseling before tying the knot. There are definitely some things that us therapists can offer to you that will help just eliminate some of the things that can be avoided. Sometimes we do things that are detrimental without even meaning to, and it's because we don't know what we don't know, and counseling can be a great resource to help you just avoid trauma that's unnecessary. Do address what ended your past relationships. A lot of times we tend to think that, well, I just was with the wrong person. But the reality is that longevity in marriage and relationships is a choice. And if something has happened that has created a situation where we are no longer making that choice, unless we fully understand why we got to that place, there's a really great chance that it's going to show up maybe in the same way or maybe just in a different way in our new relationship. And if we don't address that, it's just going to be a perpetual cycle. I also mentioned that 80% of marriages that have mental illness end in divorce. Well, I want you to consider for just a moment, what does that mean for the 40% of marriages that have at least one person who's been previously married? Isn't there a chance that there might have been mental health issues or other issues that weren't addressed that caused that first divorce? We like to think that the grass is greener on the other side. But as Kurt said, the grass is greener where it's watered. And part of watering that grass is being responsible to take a look into yourself, to self-reflect, to think about who am I, what role did I play in the failure of that last relationship, and what things do I need to address so that this relationship that I'm focused on now can thrive and be successful. Do be patient. I mentioned this before. I'm going to say it twice. Your ready isn't their ready. Whether it's the kids or it's the family, this is one thing that I messed up on. I was so eager and so excited to be a wife and to be a mom. I accepted my kids wholeheartedly. They were my boys from the moment I laid eyes on them, but I didn't consider, I was too immature to consider the depths of heartbreak that his family and her family had endured before I came along. I wasn't trying to be insensitive, but they were hurting me, and I took it personally. I was rejected, and I reacted. I isolated, and I had a really difficult time with that. And so if I had known, if someone had sat down and said, Tamera, Justin might have been ready, which is debatable, but they definitely were not ready. And if I'd had that perspective, like what Carol was talking about, my reaction would have been different. I would have been more patient. I probably would have had lower expectations. I would have allowed them space to get used to the idea that this new woman was in Justin's life. Do have realistic expectations. Like I said, it's kind of sensationalized. Like everybody's doing it, just get divorced and get remarried, and you can be friends, and you can go on vacations together. And as I said, that certainly does happen. But in most of those situations, it doesn't happen for a long time. There's a process that people have to go through to heal, to develop a friendship so that they can share that life together. And there's a lot of times where it doesn't happen at all. So it's important to have realistic expectations. Consider the dynamics. Try not to compare your blended family with anybody else. I see this a lot. Just like we wouldn't compare our sexual lives with another couple, or we wouldn't compare our marriages or our financial situation with other people. All of us have agreed today that comparison is the thief of joy. And the same thing exists within blended families. We have to be in the family that we are in. We have to consider the dynamic of the family that we are in. The one we come from, the one that our ex-spouse comes from, and the one that our new spouse comes from. And we need to develop our expectations based on the reality instead of what we desire. Do things as a family. I mentioned this in a sense when I talked about not segregating. Be united. Do things together. Enjoy each other's company. Try to keep the pressure off. Don't live the traditional blended life. Live a family life. Try as best as you can to not create these barriers that we tend to do. Think of it in terms of if you were married from the beginning and you were one unit before that and you were living your life and you were doing things, do them as such. Try not to be so, well, what if this kid doesn't like it? And what if that kid doesn't like it? When you start to consider all these things, instead of trusting that what you're doing for your family is healthy, you're going to start being in a situation where your kids and everybody on the outside is in control. Function as a family. Be connected. Do things together. Do create consistent and equal boundaries and expectations of all children. This is a tough one. This is one of those where the colors really sometimes don't jive, because if you have been raising your child a certain way for however long, and then you get married to somebody else, and they raise their kids a certain way for however long, and they don't agree, we're in trouble. This is where the counseling comes in, whether it's before or now. It's helpful, because if you think that what you're doing is right, and I imagine that you do, because most of us do, like, my way is the right way, don't you see? You're doing it wrong. It's not helpful. We have to come together. We have to be on the same page. It's true with absolutely everything about marriage and about family life. And if you make exceptions because, well, my kid can handle it. Cell phones are a good example. If you have one parent who has a 12-year-old and the other parent also has a 12-year-old, and you're thinking, well, my kid can have a phone. They're mature enough. They can handle it. And the other one, oh, no, they're not mature enough. You have to develop some sort of standard that is consistent across the board, because this creates a lot of resentment, not only with the kids, but within your marriage, because you're not on the same page. And it's challenging with biological kids, but it's even more challenging whenever you've got other parents also involved, because maybe the two of you agree, but the other parent doesn't. The co-parent totally disagrees. They want to allow something you don't, or you allow something that they don't. This is where it gets super complicated. So good communication across the board is absolutely essential. Having the best relationship you possibly can with your co-parent is incredibly important. And having good communication with your new spouse is incredibly important in order to eliminate some of that tension. Do practice balanced self-care and couple care. So while unfortunately, a lot of times when there's a divorce that occurs and dating begins and new marriage happens, sometimes the kids do get neglected. So this in no way implies that you should further neglect your responsibilities. We shouldn't get carried away. But just like in a traditional marriage that's only had one husband, one wife, and all biological kids, you've got to prioritize your marriage. You can't allow your children or other outside things, distractions, selfishness to get in the way of spending time together and connecting. This can be a challenge, especially if you're like monitoring schedules. Jimmy has to be here and Sally has to be there, and you're kind of running all over the place, and you have visitation this day, you're exchanging on that day, and so you're going to have to be intentional. You're going to have to intentionally carve out time to connect with your spouse, to plan things out. It doesn't necessarily happen spontaneously. Even in a normal, busy, rushing family, it's difficult. But when you're dealing with a whole lot of other people and a whole lot of other personalities, you can get lost in the mix. So you can either end up neglecting all of that and sort of, not taking responsibility, or you can wind up being so focused on everything else that you lose sight of your own relationship with each other. This is the most important one that I want to share with you today, which is to put your relationship and fellowship with God individually and as a family first. I can't emphasize this enough. I told you initially that if it weren't for God being the foundation of my marriage, I would not be standing here today, and I couldn't be more serious in saying that to you. It was conferences like this, it was classes, it was books that saved our marriage. Without those interventions, without that support, Justin and I would be another statistic. And my kids would be in a broken home. an even more broken home. With God first, you can accomplish a whole lot more things. Because when you've lost it, he's about the only thing that can help you find it, because nobody's perfect. No one is going to be able to do what he can to restore you the way that he can. I'm going to close with some resources for you today, and they're not that different than the ones that I provided you for mental health. The first thing that I want to mention is counseling services. Whether you live in the Pearland area or you live somewhere else, there are counselors all over this country who are skilled, even in blended families and in co-parenting relationships, that can help you navigate this in the best way possible. I know that there's a lot of shame and stigma associated with getting counseling, but I will tell you it's the bravest and most honorable thing a person can do. It is so vulnerable, but it's so helpful. Marriages can thrive when they have the appropriate support, and so I encourage you to reach out to a counselor near you if you feel like things are rocky, or if you're thinking about entering into a blended family situation and you want to start off on the right foot. Next, I want to talk about community. So as I've mentioned before, we are not wired to go through this life alone. We need other people, and there are a lot of other people who are in your same shoes, and maybe you don't know it. Maybe you pass by them in church every Sunday and you don't realize that maybe they're going through the same struggles you are, and maybe their kids are going through the same struggles as your kids. And if you combine, if you get together and you are in community with one another, you can share that burden. Life groups are a great way to do that. It's a great way to connect with people. If you're not involved in a life group in your church, whether it's Crosspoint or somewhere else, I would encourage you to seek out that community, to gather with a group of people who are there to do life with you. They don't have to be blended for them to be there with you and for you to be with them. Some things are just the same for all of us. Marriage is hard, parenting is hard, but we need community. There is also a conference that's specifically designed, it's a Christian conference for blended families, and it's called Blended and Blessed. I have put the URL here. I highly recommend this. It is specifically for blended families. It's a wonderful resource. They have a lot of great information, and they also follow it up. They have a podcast, articles, and additional resources at thefamilylifeblended.com, which is in association with the Blended and Blessed Conference. There is so many good resources available there. You do not have to do this alone. There are other people out there, and there is a lot of information out there to give you the support that you need at the touch of, at your fingertips. You just have to search it up and take a look, and I highly recommend it. I thank you so much for hanging out with us today and making it to the home stretch. And if you're watching this later, thank you for chiming back in and seeing what we have to offer. And I just am praying for God to bless your marriages. And for those of you that are blended, you do not have to be a statistic. I hope you have a great evening and enjoy your date night.